This is a map of Europe during World War II, and this is Switzerland. They were officially neutral in the conflict, but some say they had a hidden hand. They were allegedly helping the Nazis while claiming to be on the side of the Allies. They did everything they could to keep their distance from both sides, refusing to pick an alliance. But if they really were just trying to stay out of it, why were they profiting so heavily from selling weapons to both sides? And what were they doing with all that money? Well, we've got you covered. Here's the story behind the Swiss Nazi gold scandal. But first, what exactly was Nazi gold? The answer actually lies in the previous question. So let me ask another one. Where did the Nazis get all their money? Well, they got it by robbing people. As they took over Europe, they stole everything they could get their hands on. They took valuables like jewelry and gold bars from Jewish homes and businesses. They even set up special departments within their organizations to oversee this process. It was a well-oiled machine. But they didn't just take these items for themselves. They used them as currency to fund their war effort. This was their Nazi gold. Now, this is where the Swiss come in. You see, countries need banks. And Switzerland's national bank, the Swiss National Bank, or SNB, was no exception. But unlike other banks, it also had the responsibility of collecting and safeguarding valuables like gold for the country. In 1933, when Hitler came into power in Germany, the SNB began buying gold from the Germans. At first, everyone was shocked. This was the height of the Great Depression, and Europe was not doing well financially. But the Swiss saw an opportunity. They knew the Germans were desperate for money, and they offered them a deal: buy our gold and pay us back in German marks. At the time, the Germans needed help. And this deal seemed like a way out of the doldrums. But it also meant that the Swiss now had a lot of Nazi money on their hands. So how did they get it there? Well, smuggling was one method. Smugglers would carry suitcases filled with gold across the border and store it in secret locations throughout Switzerland. Another method was using front companies. These were legitimate businesses that were set up specifically to launder money. The most common way, however, was using diplomatic pouches. The Swiss government would send diplomats to Germany with orders to bring back as much gold as possible. They would then melt down the gold and ship it to Switzerland, where it would be stored until it could be sold. The profits would then be given to the Nazis in return for more gold. This may have been going on for years, but it all came to a screeching halt when Allied troops seized a train carrying gold near the end of the war. When the US Army discovered the train, they found out it was carrying over 200 tons of gold bars. Now, this was a lot of money, and it raised a lot of questions. Who was the gold supposed to be delivered to? And how did the Nazis get their hands on so much gold in the first place? As it turns out, the gold was supposed to be delivered to the Swiss National Bank. The Nazis were planning on using it as leverage to force the Swiss to give them even more money. But as soon as the Allies found out about it, they put a stop to that. They quickly cut off Switzerland's access to international banking systems and seized all of the Nazi gold that was in transit. This included the 200 tons on the train, as well as an additional 180 tons that was in Switzerland at the time. But what did they do with it? Well, it's complicated. Basically, the Allies couldn't agree on what to do with the gold. The British wanted to use it to pay for war damages in Britain, while the Americans wanted to divide it among the victorious Allied nations. Eventually, they decided to create a special commission to oversee the distribution of the gold. The commission came up with a plan to divide the gold among the major Allied powers based on their contributions to the war effort. But before the gold could be divided, it disappeared. That's right, Somehow, the gold went missing. There are conflicting reports about what happened next. But we know that the French were the first to notice that their share of the gold was missing. They accused the Swiss of stealing it and demanded an investigation. The Americans agreed and sent a team of experts to Switzerland to look into the matter. What they found was shocking. The Swiss had somehow managed to replace the Nazi gold with worthless bars. They had melted down the gold and recast it, making it almost impossible to track. But the Swiss weren't stupid. They knew the Allies would eventually find out what they had done, so they took steps to hide the evidence. They bribed key people in the US Treasury and the British War Assets Corporation to look the other way. They also created a false paper trail to make it seem like the gold had been properly distributed. It wasn't until years later that the truth came out. After the war, the French and British governments began investigating the Swiss for their role in the Nazi war machine. They uncovered a massive web of lies and deception that had been hiding in plain sight. The Swiss had been working with the Nazis for years, and they had used their position as a neutral country to profit from the war. But the details of their crimes were even more shocking. The Swiss had been laundering money for the Nazis since before the war even started. They had helped them set up secret bank accounts, and had even provided them with forged documents. They had also been buying stolen goods from the Nazis, including jewelry and art. And then there was the gold. When the Swiss were finally caught, they tried to make a deal with the Allies to avoid prosecution. They offered to pay back the value of the gold in Swiss francs, but the Allies refused. They wanted justice, and they got it. The Swiss were fined and forced to give up many of their wartime profits. They were also banned from international banking for several years. But what about the victims? Many of the items that the Swiss had been laundering for the Nazis had been stolen from Jewish families in Germany and France. The families had already lost their valuables, and now the Swiss were profiting from their loss. The Swiss government tried to argue that they were just trying to do business, but the victims weren't having it. They took the Swiss to court and demanded compensation for their stolen property. The Swiss government resisted, but eventually they agreed to pay out a total of $70 million. As for the gold itself, it was divided among the four victorious powers: Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. Each country used the gold to rebuild after the war. But the scandal didn't end there. Decades later, new evidence emerged that showed the full extent of the Swiss Nazi gold scandal. It turned out that the Swiss had been involved in far more than just laundering money and selling stolen goods. They had been actively helping the Nazis carry out their war crimes. The Swiss government had been providing the Nazis with information about Jewish businesses and individuals, and they had even helped deport Jews to concentration camps. When this information came out, the Swiss were shocked. They had always been proud of their neutrality and their role as a safe haven for those fleeing persecution. But now it seemed that they had been duped by the Nazis. The Swiss government apologized for their role in the Holocaust and began working to make amends with the Jewish community. They set up a foundation to provide financial aid to survivors of the Holocaust and their families, and they also began educating the public about the dangers of anti-Semitism and racism. But the scandal had a lasting impact on Switzerland. The country's reputation as a neutral and trustworthy nation was tarnished forever. And the Swiss government was left with a difficult question. How do you atone for the sins of your country? The Swiss government has spent years trying to answer that question. They have released thousands of documents about their role in World War II, and they have worked to make sure that such a scandal never happens again. The Swiss government has also taken steps to educate the public about the dangers of nationalism and racism. They have set up museums and memorials to the victims of the Holocaust, and they have launched a campaign to promote tolerance and understanding. But the Swiss are still paying the price for their role in the Nazi war machine. The country is still seen as a safe haven for criminals and dictators, and the Swiss government is still being sued by victims of Nazi persecution. But, despite the challenges, the Swiss are determined to learn from their mistakes. They know that they can never undo what happened during World War II. But they are committed to making sure that it never repeats itself. Alright, folks, that's gonna do it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching, and a big thank you to our supporters who made this video possible. Be sure to tune in next time for more historical tales.